And just to try and make the session less formal, we're using Zoom meetings. So I'm going to ask you all to just be sure to mute your mics when you're not speaking. And as you may be aware now, the DC-AAPOR members who are attending today also have a chance to win a copy of Laura and Emma's book, and Martha McCroy, the DC-AAPOR Programme Chair, will announce today's book winner at the end. But now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Laura and Emma.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Martha. So hi everyone, and welcome to the session today. We're really excited to share more about our book with you and to hear your thoughts and comments on it. Next slide, please. So first, I'll start with explaining how we ended up writing a book about our work at the Office for National Statistics. Next slide, please. So ONS began to develop online surveys in 2010. We started with the Labour Force Survey, which is the largest household survey in the UK and provides the official measures of employment and unemployment. During this time, our design approach was to copy and paste content from the traditional survey mode. So by this, I mean we would take the questionnaire content and letters used in the face-to-face and the telephone modes and lift and shift them into the online versions. There was some qualitative research carried out on this approach, and the research revealed that a lift and shift approach was not suitable for online data collection when the interviewer was removed from the process. Therefore, from 2015 onwards, we began to transform the UK Labour Force Survey instead as an alternative approach to its development for online. This work was and still is ambitious and it's radical, mainly being as it involves abandoning existing respondent letters and the questionnaire and starting afresh. So we learned from our earlier investigations into developing online surveys that in order to achieve and maximise response and then gather quality data, that we needed to refocus away from the data user needs and move to prioritise our respondents by putting them at the heart of the design process. This was where we started exploring user-centred design, and that originated from the technology industry. And we started to explore how we could combine that with established best practice from social research and from the survey world. This led us to develop a new framework which amalgamated both approaches, and we called that the Respondent Centred Design Framework, and that is one of the main focuses of this book, and forms the centre of all of our work essentially on transformation in ONS. We then began to present this method and our work at national and international conferences. Initially, we were quite apprehensive about doing this, as we were fully aware that we were sharing some preliminary findings and also novel methods. But it was from sharing at these events that our confidence grew in what we were doing. We began to receive some really positive feedback and support for the approach, and this spurred us on to continue pursuing it. We were then approached individually by some key people in our field, and they suggested that we consider writing this method formally in a book. So at first we thought, that was completely unattainable, and it's something that was, beyond our ideas of what was possible. So we were just happy for the support. But as other similar suggestions came in and put to us, we started to take it more seriously and began exploring options with Sage Publishing, and it went from there. Next slide, please. So I'll now briefly provide an overview of what you'll find in the book. Next slide, please. So the book starts with the forwards and the endorsements. So we were honoured that John Dillman agreed to write the forward for us, and we were delighted with what he wrote. We have received endorsements from both peers in the survey field and also in the user experience field. And for us, it was really important to achieve those endorsements from people from both sectors for two reasons. The first reason being that this book aims to bridge the divide between the two sectors. So when we were doing this work, we struggled to find an existing book that did this for us, and we had to jump between the two and to sort of get that insight and that information at the beginning of our work. The second is that it is intended to be used by those working in both sectors. So we wanted to gather support from leads in each. We were very grateful to receive the endorsements that we have from the people listed on screen. And you can visit the Sage website to read them all in full. Next slide, please. So when it came to writing a book, it was important for us and for credibility reasons that we had qualitative and quantitative evidence to back up the methods that we were promoting. Therefore, when we came to write the book, it made sense to reflect this in the structure, hence it being a book of two halves. So we firstly describe the theory, and then we give examples of how we put that theory into practice and the results in the second half of the book. Next slide, please. So the main body, or the theory part of the book, consists of 5 chapters that you see here. So chapter 1 shares the principles, frameworks and heuristics that form the foundations of respondent-centred design. This chapter then also goes on to discuss each set in turn, but it's done within the context of survey design. So we purposely made the effort to contextualise the principles to surveys and not just leave them broad as they are at the moment. And we basically share how they can be used to create a respondent-centred survey. So it's quite prescriptive in that sense. Chapter 2 shares and discusses what respondent-centred design is, why it's important, and how to apply it to survey development. This includes how to establish respondent needs and how to integrate them into your design processes. The framework that we developed is also included in that section to support understanding. Chapter 3 shares and discusses agile delivery and how to apply its phased iterative development and testing to survey development. It shares how agile delivery is different to traditional waterfall project management for survey development, and it also tackles the common myths associated with agile, which often end up being a barrier for adopting that method. The learning outcomes for each agile phase in the context of survey design are also provided. Chapter 4 shares and discusses practical aspects relating to planning and preparing qualitative respondent-centred research. The chapter acts as a bit of a checkpoint really for all the things that you need to have in place before beginning your research, and it includes sections on data protection and ethics, research grids and recruitment matrices. Chapter 5 then shares and discusses practical aspects relating to conducting and analysing qualitative respondent-centred research. This is across the recruitment, testing, transcription and analysis stages, and it also describes the cognibility technique that we mentioned in the book and we advocate, which you will initially read about in the earlier chapters of the book. Next slide, please. The second half of the book shares the practice side, and that is done then through demonstration and use of 3 case studies. So we share the iterative approach taken to developing the content, and we also share what went well and what didn't go so well. That is all part, obviously, of redesigning and learning, and we think those insights are just as important as the things that went well. So chapter 6 focuses on how we've applied RCD to the development of push-to-web survey respondent engagement strategies. So we developed a whole new engagement strategy for the transformed surveys, and that includes the application of respondent-centred design to the envelopes, through to the letters and the leaflets and any between-word correspondence that we've developed. And it's important to note that this chapter includes multiple case studies, whereas some of the other chapters then focus on one large case study. So chapter 7 shares how we've applied RCD to the development of the household composition and socio-demographic questions. That is Emma's area of expertise, asked in the online labour force survey, and that is one in-depth case study. And then chapter 8 shares how we've applied RCD to the development of the key labour market questions asked on the LFS, and that includes multiple case studies. So that concludes my brief overview of what is included in the book, and I hope it's really giving you a feel for what it's about. But I'll now pass to Emma to do the hard sell on the book's 5 unique features. So over to you, Em.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. If we can go to the next slide, please. So there's a few unique sort of features to the book, and I just wanted to talk briefly about them. And they're features which we feel makes the book a bit different to others that are potentially already out there. Next slide, please. So the first, which Laura mentioned earlier, is really about bridging the divide between the 2 fields. So as Laura said, when we first sort of started this work, we realised that there were really 2 sort of distinct fields of literature and methodology which would be important for us to understand and for us to draw on. The first one was the sort of survey research and the traditional qualitative methods which usually accompany that. And then the other, which Laura mentioned, was the field of sort of user experience design and the usability techniques that sort of go hand in hand with that. And as Laura said, during our early work, we really found ourselves to be just sort of jumping between the 2 fields, and there didn't really appear to be sources which sort of bridge that gap for us. We were really sort of left finding our own way to do it, and I'm not going to lie, at times that was really very challenging, because we were sort of attempting here to develop surveys that were robust, that collected the data that was required by our data users, whilst also still meeting respondent needs and having good usability and having good accessibility as well. So we really learned as we were progressing here, and we really refined the methods that we were using, and we developed that framework that Laura mentioned earlier to share with others, and that shows how to apply then the best practice from both the fields, and that is a key aspect of the book. Next slide, please. The book also shows how to apply respondent-centred design to the sort of full end-to-end journey and not just sort of one part of it. When we were undertaking literature searches, we found that the existing work quite often focuses on development of either the survey itself or the accompanying materials, so the pre-notification letters, advance letters, that kind of thing. But we found actually that isolated development of those is not actually optimal. And instead, actually, we need to look at the full end-to-end sort of respondent journey holistically, I guess, and really apply respondent-centred design throughout that. So that involves, for example, identifying all the sort of touch points that exist along the way. So when a respondent might engage with you, or when they might be sort of interacting with one of your products. And that really helps you to sort of think about any barriers to completion at each stage, or even sort of how one stage might affect the expectations or the needs at the next stage. So it also allows you to develop that sort of consistent look and feel, and that gives your respondent a sense of sort of legitimacy, a confidence at each step, and that's what then builds their engagement, and in turn that reduces drop off throughout the entire process. That really, we sort of preach that starts really at the very beginning. So any of you that have come to talks, which we've done before, might have found the example that we talk about, which is the envelope. And that's the envelope that contains the sort of pre-notification letter, or your first contact with the respondent. And I mean, you can build the best survey going, but if the respondent doesn't open that envelope because it looks like junk mail, well, then it doesn't really matter how good your survey is, because they're never going to see it. And then you can have the best materials in the world, the best advance letter in the world, but if the respondent moves from that letter to the online sort of login process for the survey, and they don't make the link because the website landing page looks different in some way, then they might sort of begin to worry about legitimacy and either fail to go further and complete the survey, or that might impact on the data they're actually willing to give you because they have concerns. So the book explains in sort of further detail why this is all important, and how to apply RCD to the full sort of end-to-end journey. Next slide, please. It also shows how to meet everyone's needs. So quite often when Laura and I have presented on this topic, we get a comment or a question which is, well, that all sounds fantastic, and I really want engaged and motivated respondents to complete my survey, and I really want to increase my response rates, but how can I meet those respondent needs without sacrificing the ability to meet my data user needs? And that is a myth that is quite prevalent, that you can't meet both the data user need and the respondent needs simultaneously. And we outline why and how we can debunk that myth, essentially. Part of that is by really redefining the roles of the people involved in the survey development. So, for example, we engage analysts and data users really early on in the process, and we really make sure that we know what data is required and why that is required. But then we actually remove them from the room when the redesign is underway, and we go out and we test early to ensure that we're really designing based on insights from our respondent users, and not making just assumptions about their needs and designing in the boardroom, essentially. The book also talks about testing by undertaking qualitative testing, which combines that traditional sort of cognitive interviewing technique with aspects of usability testing, which has been pioneered by the user experience industry, that both Laura and I have sort of mentioned through this. And most of the literature that we found out there kind of focuses on one or other of the fields, but we found it is necessary to actually use both together in a session. That really allows you to establish the respondents' mental models, so what they are meaning and understanding by concepts, and what terminology they use and so forth. And that allows you to fully understand what your question is actually measuring, rather than just sort of assuming that we know what it will measure. And doing that really allows you to ensure that you can design questions that really do meet that data user need, whilst also not adding burden to the respondent. So the book provides really practical instruction on how to do this. As Laura mentioned earlier, that's buried within chapters 4 and 5, and explains how doing so alongside other techniques allows you to really meet those two needs, the respondent and the data user. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that's what it's all about, really. It's theory and practice. I won't go into this too much, as Laura mentioned it earlier, but there's both sort of theoretical and practical aspects in the book. We found that many texts sort of focused on the theory, but we thought it was important to really demonstrate that practical application, and that's done mainly using the case studies. We realised we've been there, that sort of making these changes in the way things are done can be really daunting, but we hope that the case studies show that, I mean, we applied that theory to huge NSI surveys successfully, and hopefully others can do that too, as well as applying it to smaller projects as well. Next slide, please. We've also made it practical by using pedagogical features, and I can't believe I've actually just said that word correctly because I've been struggling with that all day, but they really encourage you to consider how you can apply RCD to your own work. So we wanted it to be really active rather than passive, so we use these features to really challenge you about how you can apply that theory. So as well as tips, we've got contextualized what we call stop, listen and design reflective points. So these refer to, for example, a thought piece or an activity that you can undertake to help you sort of understand and apply the theory. For example, we might suggest that you stop and that you take a moment to sort of really empathize with your respondent. For example, considering what your survey might actually be competing against for their time. Or we might say to listen. So that might involve thinking about maybe what opportunities you could take to sort of undertake some early testing and so to actually listen to your respondents. Or, for example, we might say to design. So that might involve finding out the appropriate reading age for your audience and really using that in the design of your questions, which is very important. And we also appreciate that in many ways we are in a really fortunate position. We work for a really large NSI, and we've got the resource, budget and motivation that really does allow us to invest in this approach. It hasn't always been that way, but we're there now. And when we began writing this book, we were actually really keen to sort of communicate that a lot of good can be done with little sort of carefully invested resource. And we've tried to show that by adding tips and content sort of scattered throughout the book that's aimed at those with potentially lower budgets or less resource available to them. Next slide, please. So that's about the end of what I've got to say. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thanks for listening and for being here with us. We hope that we've sort of given you some insight into the book, and we really do welcome feedback if you decide to go and give it a read. And if you do, we really hope that it will help in your own journey to developing respondent-centred questions. Just to mention some key information, as Amanda sort of mentioned earlier, the book is in print now. We've received our author copies, which is very exciting in the UK, and the release date is imminent. I believe it's actually about today that it's on Amazon. For the US, it's a bit later. We don't have a specific date, unfortunately. Apparently it doesn't work like that, but we are told it's available later this month, but it's available to pre-order. And just also to mention that we have applied to lead a short course at AAPOR 2022. We are really keeping our fingers crossed that that gets accepted, and if so, we will hope to see some of you there. So yeah, that's the end of me speaking, and I think just happy to take questions or even just to hear your thoughts on everything we've said and opinions perhaps of the book so far.
So I have a question. Are you able to share any of the findings? Because it's great hearing what's in it. It's certainly intriguing, but it would be wonderful if you could give some examples of what you learned. A lot of the kind of parameters or things that I think are sort of best practices that I think many of us have put in place, but it would be great to hear some of the specifics if you can share them.
We can certainly circulate reports that are published. So like Emma sort of mentioned as well, this work covers the end-to-end. So there's a lot of, there's about 5 years worth of research at the moment on just the letters and the leaflets over different periods, and then about different products. And then that also links to the questionnaire design itself. So there's probably too much to share in this session right now, but we can definitely circulate some reports later on that have summaries in there as well. You can kind of look through those, but consistently, I guess that we find there are some consistent key needs that come out of letter and leaflet and envelope engagement. So respondents consistently provide the same things that they need to know. We've sort of listed those in the reports. So we always make sure that we design now to meet those and have those needs covered off. No matter what survey it is, you can chop and change the information, but as long as you cover off those main points, then you should be meeting those needs. And then when it comes to the questionnaire, it's very specific to the exact topic that you're looking at. So a lot of the insights are based on the mental model research that we conduct, and that tends to inform a lot of the design processes. So there's not sort of one particular tip we can sort of say about the questionnaire stuff, but we can share write-ups about the insights that have been gathered from the in-depth research on the qualitative testing around those topics. Sorry,
Laura, could you give maybe an example of, a major change or something that you, even if you were talking about the case studies, if you have anything that you could share?
Yeah, I think on the letters and the leaflet, so like I said, we sort of abandoned the content that existed originally and we built everything from scratch. So with the letters and with the research that we conducted, we are able to now link back every piece of content to a piece of research that demonstrated that was needed to be there. So there's the typical things around needing to know timing, needing to know who the organisation is, needing to know that it's legitimate, how it's going to serve society, and how it's going to be useful for their time. And then there's information on the topic of the survey. But yeah, just making sure that certain things aren't left out, because sometimes there are discussions about not including timings in letters because the survey might be very long. But like we learned from our work, that if you don't do that, you're going to really put people off from the very beginning. So don't mislead them by not giving them that information and sort of trap them into a very long survey, because that's not going to do you any favors in the long term. So be very explicit, be very upfront with the respondent. That's the best way, like that honesty policy. Let them plan, enable them to plan by giving them those insights up front and that information up front, and then they'll do your survey at a time that's appropriate for them. But asking them, not being truthful or not giving them the information about the survey, and then they start it and then they realise it's a 40-minute survey, you're more likely to result in drop off from the comments that we had in our work. I'm not sure if there's anything you want to share from the socio-demographic work by any chance.
So the socio-demographic section is sort of one big case study, especially for the household bit. I guess one of the main learnings that we took from that is that the online version actually looks different from the interviewer version, which can be quite controversial in some areas. But what we found was that respondents actually needed different things for those two different modes. And by failing to give them that, it really did add to a sense of burden and a sense of frustration. What they needed in the online mode was to lay everything out very clearly. What they needed in the interviewer mode was to just sort of get on and do it. And by failing to do that, respondents felt, particularly in the interviewer mode, that the interviewers then weren't actually listening to them, which makes it really hard for our interviewers who have a difficult job in the first place, right? So it was the insights that we gathered, particular to those modes, that really directed our redesign. And I suppose that's the biggest thing I took away from that. The detail of that is in the book for anyone that's interested. And I won't go into it because it's about 30 odd pages long. But yeah, that was the overall sort of key finding, I suppose.
Thank you. Yeah, and in doing that work, I think it's really important to note that something that's super effective is that if you recycle, spend a lot of time learning and engaging with your respondent, but then start to recycle the language that they use. So don't use the ONS terms, or don't use the British government terms for things. Use the terms that the public are regularly using in their discussion with you. If they're rephrasing things in a particular way, if that's common understanding across a lot of respondents, use that word instead. It doesn't matter that it doesn't match with the data user need, but you explore through your qualitative testing that they are understanding it in a way that's intended. So it's just really matching up their expectations of what's in front of them, and also making them sort of feel like they have an identity and affiliation with it as well. So a lot of the time we found that in the traditional survey that people feel like it isn't for them. So the wording is very formal. It uses the Queen's English. trying to sort of bring down the reading age and making sure that we're being very approachable, but obviously having the right tone, because there's the fine line. It's a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears when you're government communicating with the public. You can't be too friendly, you can't be too harsh. So somewhere in the middle, but those types of things are really important as well.
Matt, you've had your virtual hand up for a while.
Yeah, no problem. And I think you're answering a lot of the questions I had. I thought it was really interesting to see what you guys have in here, and I look forward to reading it. So I hope I'm not asking the same question a different way, but one thought that occurred to me is, everything you've said so far makes sense if you can do cognitive testing and pre-testing and things like that. But a lot of the times we're just one person reading a questionnaire and trying to evaluate it. And I know one of the things I personally do is just like you mentioned somebody mentioned the word empathy and empathizing with your respondents. And I try to, as much as I can, put myself in the place of a person with a different education level or different world experiences. And I was wondering if you guys have any advice. If it's in the book, tell me to read it. I don't want to take away from your profits. I'll come to the short course. But, when you're one person evaluating a questionnaire, are there any tips or tricks you have for that make it more respondent centered?
Yeah, for sure. We really recommend that if you can't, we've had to go through this through COVID development when we're developing questionnaires ourselves. We've not been able to cognitively test everything. So we've had to look through the framework, see the parts we can kind of pull out and still retain to make things as respondent centered as possible. So one of those things would be the readability check-in and meeting the reading age. So, when developing questions, if you haven't got time to cognitively test, it's really useful to use things like Google Analytics, look at common words, look at things like Hemingway reading app, which is where you can pop in text into the box and then it tells you the reading age of the text. So sometimes it'll say university level, obviously it goes right down. So if you find out the reading age of the average reading age of your country, you can then sort of amend the text you're putting in and hopefully make it more accessible for people. So there are things like that you can be doing. And then there are also assistive technologies that you can use to run products through. And we talk about these in the book as well. So purely for accessibility purposes as well. So if you want to check if your letter is accessible, or if you want to look at maybe your questionnaire content, there are things out there that you can do at desk if you haven't got the opportunity to go and send something to an accessibility testing centre, which would be the gold standard then in doing that.
So we have a few other questions. I'm going to try and encourage people to ask their questions, but thank you for putting them in the chat. I think just to, and James and Nathan, if I'm not getting this right, do jump in and say what you mean. So I think that people are asking kind of what was the motivation behind this whole transformation process? What kind of were the challenges that sort of got you along this path? That would be interesting. And if you could say a bit more about the needs of the online work.
Yeah, sure.
Which might be in the same context.
That's fine. Do you want me to take this, Em?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so basically all of this, when I started exploring online around 2010, and like I said earlier on, that's where we basically explored just taking the existing content as it was, lifting and shifting that from the interviewer mode and putting that into the online version. So, from doing a lot of research with interviewers and speaking to interviewers at the time, as a researcher, we were very cautious about that because we were listening to the feedback. They were saying that, these particular questions are difficult to ask as they are. We often have to reword them. So then we were quite concerned about doing that piece of work, but then we had to get the evidence really to show that maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. So we couldn't just, go and say we're not going to lift and shift, because obviously it required a huge amount of funding to go into transformation. So we needed to evidence why that change was potentially needed. So anyway, we ran a lot of qualitative research across the office with the public on this lift and shift version of the labour markets, or the labour force survey, sorry. And it was really through that research that we found out that respondents were really struggling to complete that survey without any interviewer intervention. So you can imagine being sat there during a cognitive interview and somebody's really, really struggling to respond to the question, or they're overwhelmed by information that's provided on screen and they don't even understand that guidance that's being provided. Obviously, interviewers are trained There's a lot of resource put into training our interviewers, and they are very, very good at their jobs. But obviously, when you're given a questionnaire to complete to a member of the public who hasn't had that training, it basically fell over. It didn't work, and that's where we really registered that there could be huge changes in our data quality if we did carry on pursuing that approach. There was also an SNET at the time, which was showing evidence from countries that were more advanced than us in the online space, and basically showing that when they did lift and shift, that they did actually experience a change in their time series anyway. So the two things combined, so obviously the reservations around making a change for questionnaires, we all know, is that people are concerned that it will change their time series and change their data. But the evidence from the SNET was kind of supportive of our work and of our plight to want to change, because we were saying, well, look, this work is showing that these countries have tried the lift and shift, and actually they've experienced a break in their time series. So we're likely to experience that as well if we lift and shift. A qualitative research is giving us that evidence potentially that we will also experience changes in our data quality because of the challenges with that understanding. So why don't we take advantage of the fact that there will be a break and actually transform this survey and start afresh, and really address a lot of these problems that are with the existing question set. And take the opportunity to fully cognitively test the whole survey. So, a lot of the content had not a lot, but some of the content hasn't been cog tested before. And that's common, due to the age of the survey, and cog testing only began in the 90s. So the survey's been running since the 70s. So it really was an opportunity to refresh the survey. And it also aligned with other projects in the organisation to look at sort of stripping it back and making it more focused on being a labour force survey. So because it did have a lot of other content in there, basically over the years it had grown. So it was a really good opportunity for us to sort of hit refresh, make sure that it was, it was reflective of society and of the times, and to sort of address the problems that were in the existing survey set.
Carl, do you want to go ahead and ask your question yourself? I was also interested in it, actually. Just trying to encourage everyone to talk, because it'd be nice if we could talk amongst each other as well. I know there's a lot of us.
Sure. Yeah, this is Carl Ramirez, and I asked the question about your chapter on applying agile project management principles to the survey design process, and that's intriguing. Certainly, we've done kind of iterative testing and revision, but I'm curious if you have examples of that, or what the principles are there.
I could talk a little bit about this, Laura, if you like.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're familiar with sort of agile techniques, which is a really good start. And you said that you've used sort of iterative stuff before, which was a key point of what we sort of try and encourage. In terms of examples, I'm trying to think of, I know in labour market we went backwards and forwards and we're quite agile with some of that redesign. I mean, essentially what we do is in the discovery phase, we really sort of dig in deep to the concepts that we're trying to measure, and we look at mental models and run in-depth interviews, sort of sessions, and really try and understand what do our respondents actually understand by this term, what words do they use in real everyday life, and how can we actually measure this in a way that makes sense to them, and we're actually getting the data that we think we're getting and that we actually want. Then we move forward after we've done that sort of discovery phase into alpha, and we start with that sort of redesign and iteration type process. So we undertake typically at least 3 rounds of sort of cognibility testing, which is where we're sort of meshing those cognitive interviewing and usability techniques. Now, with something like the labour force survey, when we were sort of developing that, transforming it into that labour market survey, what we did was we started with a really core set of questions, so the ones that really delivered those core outputs that we needed. And once we'd sort of started building those and testing those, and they were coming back as working quite optimally, we then added questions onto them. And what we found actually is when we were talking about one specific concept, it was actually fine. And then we added in another layer of depth, and that's when it became really confusing for people. And in that situation, then we went back to discovery and we started those in-depth interviews again to really try and understand more about that concept. How about words and terms and questions, that we're adding in were influencing their understanding in a different way. And it's only when we've really fully explored that then we move back into alpha. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I get the idea.
Does anybody else have any comments about that? An experience?
I think the main points to make are that there are very distinct phases with it, and it's very clear that you don't do any design work in that discovery phase. It purely is explorative, so you're not there taking out designs and getting feedback on it. The key difference in it is that sometimes what we would do is design something up there and go and get feedback, but we're going a step before that and getting all that discovery insight, finding out those mental models and using that to inform the first draft. And then also what's really good about it compared to the waterfall way of delivery is that you do have that flexibility to jump back and forth. You're not committed to something just because you started with it. So yeah, I think that's one of the positive things, that you can flex and you can change, and when you do come across problems, you can fix them. So that's for me is one of the main benefits of doing the survey research in an agile way.
Yeah, and what it stops really, I mean, people quite often say to us, we might not have time to sort of invest in that early discovery work, but actually that's saved us a lot of time by doing that, because otherwise you end up sort of going down a rabbit hole, and it's only 3 months down the line that you realize actually it didn't work in the first place, and you have to throw it away and start again. So we've always got those insights to fall back on. Even if we hit a problem, we can still go back to them. We can still look and say, okay, what did respondents tell us when we were doing that discovery work? And that really helps us to make it a smoother process. Even if we do end up throwing several designs away in the process, it still makes it quicker.
So Hoi was interested in the relationship between the costs of the survey and data quality, and whether this approach reduces costs. Do jump in, as I say, if I'm not translating that properly, but do you have any comments on the cost aspect?
Obviously the transformation work is still underway, so they're still running, ONS is still running with the traditional survey as the main source of outputs for the labour market survey. But the whole point being is that what we're trying to do with the transformation work is that it reduces respondent burden, it gets you the result that you're after with reduced sort of attempts and trying at it. So by having the letters performing optimally, it means you don't have to, you're more likely to get your uptake in your online. So I think we were getting around about 50% online and face-to-face when we were pre-COVID doing this experimenting work, which was really positive. We were really happy with that. And obviously the more we can maximise the online uptake, the cheaper the survey is to run. So that was one of the goals and one of the drivers for following this respondent-centred approach. But I don't have numbers, obviously I couldn't share those anyway, but this is one of the main drivers, is to reduce the cost of running the surveys, and using a respondent-centred approach means that people are more likely to do the thing you want them to do in the way you want them to do it. So yeah, hopefully reducing things like dropout and then response chasing as well through the process.
I wonder if that's been a blocker for anyone who might be on this call, or particularly, I mean, we've been talking about this work for a couple of years now. If anyone's tried to sort of implement any of the aspects, and if they've come across any blockers that perhaps we might be able to discuss, talk about, or even potentially answer.
I guess not. Okay, Valerie, you had an interesting question. I'd like to build on that. Laura and Emma, you spoke during your talk about bridging the gap between the kind of survey research world and the UX world. And Valerie was wondering about the language, and if there were different vocabulary used, and how in the book, how did you kind of cope with that, if that were in fact the case? But I'm also interested to know, should we be learning more from the UX designers than we have in the past?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so within government there's a wider movement, and an arm's length body was sort of set up, which is the Government Digital Service, and within that there's a new technology profession, and they are very much driving a lot of the redesign and redevelopment of the government services. Within that is a whole host of new roles within government. The user experience designer is in there, and obviously a lot of them came from the private sector, came from contracting into government to sort of support that work initially. So there is a whole different language associated with it. And when we were working with the UX designers in ONS that were often contractors to begin with, we had to learn their language. So that there was that sort of difficult sort of transition to sort of explain the sort of social survey world language, and then work out what they were talking about from a user experience perspective. Okay, so how did we have to like alter our language to get them to understand what we were asking for or why that was important? So there's learning on both sides for sure, and it was really really good because it really helped us to strengthen our skill set. But then also they were really grateful for that exposure because they learned a lot about why things had to be done in a particular way. So things weren't just to look pretty or to look good on screen, they had to be functional. So this wasn't about developing a shopping website where people were going on, transacting and leaving. We had to use that data at the end of it. It had to meet a certain quality. So there were often challenges around having those discussions with the UX designers about them saying this needs to look a particular way, and us saying, well, actually that doesn't function because it doesn't collect us the data we want. And the classic example we've got there is around actual hours work and usual hours work. So when we ask those questions on two separate pages, which is best practice for accessibility and for UX to have one question per page, what was happening was that people were being presented with the second question about their actual hours, and they were thinking they were being presented with the same question twice. So then they were getting confused, and then that was causing a break in their journey, and they would go back to the previous page. Oh, that is a different question, and they had to assess it. So that cognibility test in there was really key to understand that actually we couldn't conform to that exact pattern. We had to think of something different and come up with something new together, because their world and our world wasn't joining up. So yeah, it's definitely different language, but then also sharing that learning around why things need to be slightly different and imparting that sort of survey and data quality information as well through the process. But it does require very close working and collaboration to do that. You can't do that at arm's length.
I think even at a very basic level, I mean, if you go up to a user experience designer and talk about your user, they will take that as the user of a product, so the person accessing the website, whereas to the majority of the survey world, if you talk about a user, they talk about the data user. So even on that just very basic level, there are differences that you have to sort of work with and get your head around. Typically we refer to respondent centred design, but we have put a note in the book to say, where you see the word user on its own, you can kind of use those two interchangeably, and we will talk about a data user when we are talking about it in that context. So yeah, it's tricky even on a basic level sometimes.
Yeah.
Martha, did you want to jump in there?
I did actually have a question too for you. Since the respondent-centered surveys, it's focused on the respondent being as upfront to the respondent as possible, not trying to hide anything from them to get them to take the survey. But what do you do when your client wants to keep anonymity? If they are concerned that, if you're saying that this survey is being conducted for the government or for this particular organization, that might sway their answers in some way. How can you still give your respondents all of the information to be able to, comply with the survey without jeopardizing what the client would like?
I don't think we have to be explicit about who our surveys are for. It's part of our code of practice, and so we're not actually in the position where we have to share all our partners, and disclose that information with the public. But I think the only example I've got really with that is in a slightly different context, is something like when we were developing our financial survey for the households, asking people about their income and things. There's a view that we shouldn't be explicit up front about that content because it might actually deter people from taking part. But actually we found in our research that so our hypothesis was that if you don't tell people what the survey is about, you might get high uptake, you get lots of people dropping off. But if you tell people what the survey is about, you may get lower uptake but less attrition. So you'll have more of a constant completion through to the end. And yeah, we found that in our research. So being upfront with the respondent, you're not spending a lot of time then doing that chasing of people that have started and dropped off. you can move people more quickly into separate modes. I think it's, it just doesn't serve them to hold information from them. They deserve that right to be told what's being asked of them, who is going to be using their data, and to have that information up front, really. So we don't have it in the context of customers, but obviously if you were to research that with respondents and do that discovery piece of research, and then also do some testing with the public to say that this is, the list of people that are the sponsors of the survey, and then if you were to remove that list and get that feedback from them, that evidence could be used to challenge your customer, to say that, look, actually people are expecting to have that information up front, and be told truthfully about who their data is going to as well.
It's really wise as well just to think about that in terms of if it's a longitudinal survey, or if you're going to be putting out other surveys, and the effect of if the respondent does feel cheated in some way, the effect that might have on future participation as well. So just throw that in there.
Guanyi, did you have another question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you so much, Emma, Laura, for your presentation. Thank you, AAPOR, for organizing the book club. I only read the very beginning part of the book. One thing, I think this is like a huge shift of thinking for many countries, to really, from especially the developing countries that we've been working a lot with, is the thinking we've been doing this for years and it's working. We get the data, the response rate is not bad. I mean, compared to in developing countries, it's not bad. Why do we need to change, and then also do a lot of investment upfront? And so I think there's a lot convincing to do from our side to really push the thinking. There has been some interesting conversations we're having with countries. For example, one of the countries have been re-evaluating their survey questionnaires because of the switch from CAPI to CADI, and they have to shorten the questionnaire. So we ask, which part did you cut? And they said, well, we cut the questions that data were never analyzed before. So the question has been there because they have been there, but only now, because there's a urgent need to cut, and they said, okay, we never analyzed it, why don't we cut? So I think there's a lot of work from our side to really help promoting the idea of respondent-centered design. I also felt that the skills on experimentation and cognitive testing, it's really lacking in many countries. At NS National Statistical Offices, it's not straight. I mean, it's not something that we're used to do. And I felt there was also a need for capacity on that side. When I was reading the beginning, you talked a lot about respondents and users. Is there also an overlap of these two groups? The user means data user, because respondents are sort of also, the data are very relevant for them too, right? But so are the users more specifically the government policymakers? Are also the respondents, are they also users to some point, data users?
They could be if they access the data on the data archive and things, but mostly we design and consult with our main stakeholder base. So those people, departments that sponsor the questions on the labour force survey, for example. So we would engage with those people and discuss with them like what their needs are, and then develop to meet their data needs. But there, I'm not sure how often a respondent actually engages with the data that comes out, but there are students potentially that use a lot of the ONS data as well. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's how we do the stakeholder engagement anyway.
I really agree with the sort of what you were saying about the skills on cognitive interviewing as well. I think it's really easy for people to think, oh, I'll just develop a questionnaire, or just develop a survey. How hard is it to come up with a couple of questions? But what we found actually is when we engage stakeholders and we actually take them through questionnaires that they may have designed and sort of pull them apart a little bit, that they really do start to gain some empathy. And it's when you show them the impact that that might have on their data that they actually, this question that they think will work based on our evidence actually won't work, they then see things as an opportunity rather than a challenge. So what we're finding more and more is that people are more engaged with really stripping their questionnaires back and really having a good hard look at them, because then at least they know that the data that they're getting is accurate. Because certainly from our work with the labour force survey, I mean, some of the questions possibly weren't measuring exactly what we thought they were, and then you have the potential then to start actually using data inappropriately, which is not great for data quality. So yeah, we try and frame it in terms of opportunities rather than challenges, and that's got us some ways so far.
Yes, I thought your comment about the questionnaire and developing countries and the upfront research was interesting. I was going to bring Clark Letterman in from Pew, but I think he's dropped off. Nathan, you have a question.
Yeah, hi everyone. This has been great so far. This is a very basic question. I work for a government agency, and so we contract out for most of our survey work. And I'm not, in the know as far as like cognitive testing or anything, but I wanted to find out from the experts or from anyone who's willing to chime in if, I don't even know what cognitive testing is. Is that something that's contracted out? Is that something that can be done internally? So we're in the process of doing a BRFSS style countywide COVID recovery population health survey. And one of the things that we're developing the instrument internally, and we're contracting out to have that done, kind of executed and the data collected by a contractor. But I'm just curious to know if there's any basic tips or any direction that you could point me to be able to, yeah, I mean, how's cognitive testing done? I don't even know.
So Laura and Emma, you might want to answer that, but there are a lot of cognitive testing experts on this call that I could draw on. So if you want to hand that question
go for
over,
it.
that's also fine.
Just to say, in the UK context, it's very much a mixture of in-house testing and contracting out. So it's a bit of an odd setup in the UK in that we've got our competitors, but also they could be our collaborators, on a bid or on a tender or for a survey. So for example, we might do a lot of the cognitive testing in-house, but then also it might be that we have capacity issues, so we then have to contract out that work, and that is done by another agency in the private sector or not for profit. So just to kind of give that context, but yeah, happy for somebody else to respond on the what is cog testing question.
So I'm going to open that up to the people from Census, NCHS. I see people from West out here. Martha, do you want to kick it off? Martha Stapleton? Hello, Martha. Okay, how about Jessica or Patty or anyone like to leap in here? Patty.
Hi,
Thanks.
Patty. Hi, I wonder if we there's like a interagency group that meets every 3 months to sort of talk about cognitive testing within, government agencies in the US. So I wonder if we should give you some contact information that you could join that group or talk to some of us offline, because we could definitely share a lot of resources from agencies that actually do it in-house and that contract it out. So I think it's probably kind of a larger information share that we would be happy to do from the Census Bureau, or I'm sure other agencies as well.
Sure, and if you want to email me at NCHS, that's also fine. So Patty and I can lead you through.
That sounds good, because we've definitely got a lot of connections to recommend.
Yep. So actually, we are almost out of time. I just wanted to say thank you for everybody today, and thank you in particular to Laura and Emma. That was absolutely marvelous. It really was. I was fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to Martha McCroy now, who's going to announce the book winner.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone attending. So our book winner is Jake Sofronoff I'm very sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but I saw that you have attended. Congratulations. We will reach out to you shortly about getting you a copy of the book once it's fully released in the US, so later this month. But thank you very much. And I also hope you all enjoyed this session. Of course, this is one of a series because we are doing DC-AAPOR Book Club 2.0. So our next session is scheduled for February 9th. That will be Margaret Roller and Paula Vracas with their book, The Applied Qualitative Research Design, a Total Quality Framework Approach. And this was the 2021 AAPOR Book Award winner. So we hope that you will all be able to attend that. That is already available for sign up on our Eventbrite page. And we will be putting this recording of this session up on our YouTube page as well. So for those of you that know someone that was unable to attend, feel free to share the recordings. And again, thank you so much to Laura and Emma for giving us the sneak peek of the book. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being our leader here with the discussions and introducing the book. And thank you again, all DC-AAPOR and those that attended. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.